I'm the Executive Director of the Aspen Global Innovators Group. Here at the Aspen Institute and as part of our group, we are committed to advancing a free, just, and equitable society. We cannot do that without leadership from around the globe who have bright ideas, bold solutions, in order for us to accelerate improvements in health outcomes and well-being. Through the Aspen Global Innovators Group, we elevate global leaders who are leading the charge in advancing equitable transformations in health and development globally. We are a vibrant community, and I'm looking at our senior fellow here, of incredible leaders, entrepreneurs, innovators, activists, organizers, who are on a mission. We know that access to healthy food is critical to ensuring that we can all thrive, and yet inequities and lack of access abound. It is my privilege, our honor here at the Institute, to have Dr. Tlaleng Mofokeng, UN Rapporteur on the Right to Health and Aspen Global Innovators Group Senior Fellow, join us here at the Institute to share her expertise and the outcomes from her latest report, Food and Nutrition and the Right to Health, on the critical issues of access to food and nutrition. I also want to thank our co-hosts, Vital Strategies, and partners from the O'Neill Institute at Georgetown University Law Center for joining us in organizing this conversation today. And I want to note that we want to take this beyond conversation to action. So I see this community group right here in the room and those who joined us online. We are part of that vibrant army. It's a privilege to be working with you to do all the good work that it's going to take to advance society in the way it should be advanced. With that said, I'd like to welcome Dr. Tlaleng, Dr. T, our very own, to share a bit of an overview on her recent report.
Thank you. So thank you all for being here, and thank you so much, Lorna, for hosting us. And yeah, it's been, if someone just asked me now, just Tricia, like how long does it take? It takes a long time to write these reports. And I think for me, it's always so interesting, but also very affirming to see how one can have the freedom to choose to report on any issue that affects the right to health. And yet it seems every single time I'm making the right decision on the right theme, what seems like the right time. And if you take into account what's currently happening in Palestine and the way that food and food access and underlying determinants of health have been used and weaponized in that war, you can really see very clearly the intersection of food, nutrition, and the right to health. And I feel like, 5 months ago when I submitted that report, none of us could have predicted that would be one of the crisis moments that we are living in. And so the report really was about firstly showing the indivisibility of human rights and how interdependent they are, and to try and move away from the siloed approach in how we approach the different mandates and thematic areas of work. And so by looking at SDG 2 and SDG 3 together, at the time when member states are envisioning the next phase of Sustainable Development Goals, the Summit for the Future is coming up. There's a lot of talk about technology. The climate crisis is ever evident in terms of its impact. And having come out of the emergency state of COVID-19 and what that showed us in terms of malnutrition, undernutrition, overnutrition, but also the fact that successful treatment of infectious diseases require sustainable food and food security. So it's very important, I think, for me to try and distill what are really huge themes into manageable concepts and ways of thinking and processing. And what I hope my reports offer is an analysis that I'm very open, and I share this, that I use anti-coloniality and anti-racism in terms of how I analyze the world. And so my default setting is to always interrogate any system that I've inherited with, including being part of the UN system, and whether the system is working as intended or there needs to be some kind of adjustments so that it is fit for purpose and the challenges of today. And so together with the submissions that we receive from member states, which are really valuable because they do add texture to the work that I do. I can't visit every country that has a malnutrition or food insecurity problem, but by tailoring the call for contributions in the ways that I do try to balance between identifying challenges and identifying good practice, and also understanding why is it working in your area and how can we amplify this, replicate it, duplicate it in many other ways and other contexts as well. And so the reports are more than just a diagnosis of what is wrong, what are challenges, but it also often offers an opportunity on how to operationalize the right to health. And the operationalization of the right to health, I think, is where many member states get stuck, because it sounds like just an abstract idea. There are hospitals, there's clinics, therefore people should be healthy. And yet people aren't healthy because they're not investing in underlying determinants of health. And so food is a key determinant of the right to health. And of course, health is a key determinant of the successes of all of the other SDGs. Without health, none of the others are possible. And so the report, again, in conclusion, offers recommendations in terms of how I view the world currently and where I think there are potentials and opportunity for impact in the immediate term. One of the things that member states can do right now, today, to already start having impact. What are top of the solutions, innovations required in the medium term? And what kind of long-term investments are needed to ensure that those who come after us are then benefiting from a sustainable but healthy and safe environment and planet overall. And so for me, it's not just about food, nutrition, and the right to health of us as humans, but it's also about the right, under the right to health, of a healthy environment as well. As we know, the food processing, production, there are so many different steps into getting the food from production to our tables. And those processes themselves have to be sustainable, have to be equitable, and they have to be serving the population in ways that are diverse, culturally appropriate and desired, and that we realize, of course, that food is more than just the nutritional value. For many of us, food is part of our history, food is part of our memory, food is part of our relationship making, and food is part of the story of who we are as a people, but also where we go. And I was saying just yesterday, if you wanted to look at the history of colonization, you just have to look at the different spices and food choices available around the world. And if you wanted to do a sociological study of mapping the right to health, that could be a very interesting, innovative way of also telling the story using some of the submissions received. And so there are people in this room that support my mandate a lot outside of the UN in terms of research, activists, advocacy groups, and just to say thank you to all of you for the effort and the time and the belief that you have in what that mandate can do. And I think in wrapping up, I just want to say that just today I was saying to JJ and Kuni, like, I really hope this matters sometime, somewhere, because I'm particularly feeling very, very tired and exhausted. And I just wanted to acknowledge that it's important to also give ourselves some grace. And part of doing this work in an anti-racist context is to be human about it. And I think nothing humanizes all of us and bonds us more than food. And so there is joy in food, there's pleasure in food, and there's stories in food. And so it's my hope that beyond the technical content of the report, we can really get back to creating and co-creating a world that is conducive to dignity of all people, and understanding what happens when land dispossession, when corporates encroach on indigenous people's lands, when states do not protect the right to health and the right to food security as well, and that those people who are often already disempowered in society, who are already living in vulnerable situations, get pushed further to the margins because of legal processes, because of policy, because of different norms of standards of practices, and that in fact that disproportionate impact can be changed. We can change that. It's not just well, it is actually by design, right? That certain systems compound experiences for different people. And it's also by and through designing the world differently that we can have different outcomes. And so mine is to offer a pathway and a proposal to get from substantive equality, where we look beyond just equal opportunity at the right to health, but we are really intentional about understanding how power moves and shifts through each of us, by us, so that we can then really be intentional about who we center. And my proposal is that rights holders should be at the center of all of our efforts. And to restore people's dignity is a very subjective thing. No one can define for you what dignity and what a dignified life is, or what a sustainable community is. And so civil society participation is something that I'm quite particularly passionate about in terms of advocating both within the UN and in many other spaces as well. That civil society remains a key partner. And I dare say that civil society has been the only force that has actually ever put us into some form of action. Whether you're talking about HIV and access to affordable medicines and ARVs, whether you're talking about the climate crisis, whether you're talking about debt, whether you are talking about even COVID-19, it was civil society fighting for vaccine equity, what we were calling then vaccine apartheid. And in the report, I also speak about food apartheid. And so I think there's a lot in there to read and to ponder and to hopefully be inspired. And that, I remain available as a resource to all of you for the various needs that you may have. And I look forward to this conversation today. And thank you again for coming. And just to say that in the room, my work husband walked in as I started speaking. And so I've regained a little bit of a spark and energy. And at the back, we have Victor, who is the current, 4 days to go now, our independent expert on sexual orientation and gender identity, who's done phenomenal work in that mandate over the last few years. And I know that all of us in this room, will continue to appreciate the impact that he's had. And I'm glad that we all get to give you your flowers, while you can still smell them. And for real. And I've learned so much from you as your colleague, as your friend. And I just wanted to say that, even in the report, without even talking to each other, we seem to be always complimenting each other's reports at the council as well here in Geneva. And so just to say thank you, Victor, and just acknowledge your presence and your extraordinary work, and congratulations on an amazing time as an expert. So thank you.
Hello everyone. Thank you so much, Dr. T, again for your wise words. So my name is Estefania Palomino. I'm with the Aspen Global Innovators Group. And I'm very honored to welcome our panel here today. So first, I'm gonna have Isabel Barbosa, Senior Associate in Health and Human Rights Initiative at the Aspen Institute. I'm gonna invite also Salda Molde, Senior Vice President, Policy Advocacy. Dr. Nina Prasad, Director of Food Policy Program at Bloomberg. All right. So thank you so much again, Dr. T, for your wisdom and for that fantastic report. I think it really highlights that intersection between the right to health, anti-colonial practices, anti-racism, things and actions that we can take to make this space more equitable. So thank you for that. So I'm gonna get us started with a question to Dr. Nina Prasad. So the first question for you is, as you know, Dr. T's report highlights the equity concerns in the food space. So what does equity mean for you in the context of food?
Thank you so much, Estefania, for hosting us. And I just want to congratulate Dr. T again for this incredible report. As somebody who thinks about food probably an insane number of hours in a day and who squarely falls in the I live to eat camp. I don't understand the other camp at all. Like, you just eat to live. No, it's a phenomenal report. I've read it twice now. So I'm very excited to get into it. So Estefania, just to answer your question or to attempt to answer it, I think it's a question we could probably spend this entire panel talking about and just barely scrape the surface. I think, at a sort of most reductive level, equity in the food and nutrition space is about ensuring that everybody in the world has access to healthy, safe, affordable, culturally appropriate foods, and foods that promote well-being and health. And in order to achieve that, I think we have to really focus on, and this has to happen ultra-locally, on who doesn't have access, and why is that, and how can we address that? But I also think, and certainly in our work in the food policy program at Bloomberg Philanthropies, a lot of that is about informing consumers and educating people about what they're eating and is that healthy for you or not. But that's not nearly enough, and I think I could know that something is not good for me, but that may not be driving my decision to buy it. What might be driving my decision, what is likely driving my decision to buy it, is the cost. So there's an economic aspect to all of this. I may want to go home and prepare a fresh meal every day, but maybe I'm working 2 jobs. Maybe I'm a caregiver and I just don't have time. And we all know that often the burden of preparing food falls on women. And so there's a gendered aspect to this. And, certainly in the US, there's a racialized aspect to all of this. Dr. T talked about food apartheid, and, there's a brilliant activist and urban farmer here in New York named Karen Washington who sort of coined that idea of, these aren't food deserts. We live in communities of food apartheid, where you don't live in a community where you have access to a grocery store or market. You may just have a bodega. And we all know, if you live in New York, bodegas don't generally offer the healthiest things. And also, on top of that, if you are a Black child in this country or a Latino child, you are you are experiencing much more marketing. You are disproportionately targeted with unhealthy marketing as compared to white children. And so there is a racialized aspect in this country. And so I think we've just got to be kind of mindful of all of that. But I would urge us to think even beyond that. I would love to get to a place where we have equity, but I sort of challenge us to think about justice. And that is removing the systemic barriers, that are contributing to disparities. And certainly in our work, we're thinking about a food justice lens much, much more. And, as pie in the sky as it may seem, I do think we have to be very clear about what is our longer term goal and how do we get there.
Thank you. Yeah, I completely agree that there's definitely a racialized component and a socioeconomic and a gender component, and that's that's correctly highlighted in the report. So just a follow-up question for you, Dr. T. Just considering these ultra-processed foods are marketed disproportionately to minority communities, for example, here in the US, what is the impact that these foods have in traditional foodways and traditional practices that may be healthier for folks?
Yeah, so the ultra-processed foods contains very high levels of salt, sugar, and unhealthy fats, which are designed to increase some kind of flavoring so that the consumers then keep going back for the same product. But also there's colorants in food as well. And that's why, targeting children with particular colors of food and to make it seem as if it's a healthier option is also a problem. And also the preservatives that makes the food last longer in the shelves are also adding to decreasing the nutritional value in what actually ends up being sold. And so there's the issue, of course, of non-communicable diseases, malnutrition in both sense, under and over. And that it is important to highlight the role that business plays and the power that it has in this space, where you may have a lot of conflict of interest, you may have a lot of states or governments who are unable to take action because of that, but also that those ultra-processed foods and their impact on access to traditional food is that they tend to be cheaper, right? And if you take into account what Nina just said, if you are a caregiver, the burden of taking care of children and doing homework falls on you. You also work all these other jobs, and you have to save 30 minutes or an hour of cooking versus a fast food option where the food can get to the kids quicker and they can get to bed earlier, so you can perhaps even study because you are also maybe studying for a degree or something. So those are the social contexts in which food decisions are being made, but also that's kind of why corporate and industry behavior is so key to understand, because it also impacts where you're saying about traditional food and meals. They have less diversity than what we would have if we were following the indigenous traditional ways of seasonal production. So now if you want mango, you will get mango any time of the year, as if, you know what I mean? So the fact that we have the shipping and the storage, and we've added even more steps to food production, and those steps do not necessarily add nutritional value. In fact, they may, and we know in some instances, in some countries, healthier food is more expensive than fast food, and that the A-grade quality food is marked for export, where the governments are making more money from selling healthier food to the richer countries, mostly in the global north, and the produce that's left in country is of less quality, and there isn't guaranteed of that food chain where things are stored properly in the right temperature and in the right ways as well. And so I think there is that impact on what we think is traditional food or traditional ways of thinking about food, but it is really tied to culture and our experiences of food, but definitely the diversity as well. And I think taking care of the environment is part of the traditional experience, because that's how traditional knowledge is transmitted. It is through taking care of the land. And that's why you can't talk about equity in any form without talking about land and land ownership and the dispossession of land, expropriation of land, continued extractive capitalistic practices on land, and how indigenous peoples and local communities become internally displaced because of corporate interests and encroachment on those key pieces of land, leading to air, water, and air pollution as well.
Yeah. And so that's actually a great segue to speak about the private actors and about the corporations and their role in access to healthy foods. So, question for Isabel. In the report and in this discussion, we have learned that there is a framework for commercial determinants of health that is gaining traction and highlighting the role of private actors in shaping these health outcomes. So how can this framework be applied in your work in food policy?
Thank you so much, Estefania. I'm going to piggyback on something that Nina was saying before about the constraints that people face when they're living their everyday lives and making choices about what to buy in the supermarket or what to cook. And I think the one thing that I would highlight about the framework of the commercial determinants of health is that it really showcases and highlights these constraints and the things that are driving our decision making. Not long ago, a lot of the texts about non-communicable diseases and non-communicable diseases prevention, they used to talk about only lifestyle choices, and that was the way that it was referred to. And that used to place a lot of emphasis on individuals as if they were completely free to make whatever choices that, they wished. And we know that's not the case. And I think one important aspect to consider when we're thinking about price, when we're thinking about marketing, about how products are laid out in the shelves, is that those things are not a given. They might seem natural to us, but they're not natural. They were conceived to be like that. Someone thought about it for them to be like that. There's no such thing as a neutral price. Price is a product of a lot of decision making that happens between economic actors, between government. So I think the commercial determinants of health, they really showcase all of that. And when it comes to my work, I'm a lawyer, and at the O'Neill Institute, we do a lot of legal research and applied work. And I think that the law can be an obstacle. Sometimes it reinforces the status quo. It really gives more power to those that are in power. But it can also be transformative, and it can be used to push back. It can be used to challenge the environments that we're living in. And when it comes to food, it's exactly the same, right? I think it's a matter of questioning, those that are making the decisions, making sure that we're pushing governments to regulate and to do their job. And we're not taking the status quo as something that we should live with. I think it's really important to question that and to switch the narrative, of just justifying regulations and food regulations to really saying that, in order to realize human rights and to realize the right to health, we need governments to regulate. They must regulate. So it's more of a duty.
Absolutely. Regulation and of course, being able to stop blaming people and thinking that there's more systematic ways of solving this issue. So Sandra, in your work, how are people communicating on how to take action against these corporate interests and these corporate actions that Isabel was pointing out, and of course about things that are outside their control?
Thank you. Thanks for the question, Estefania, and congratulations on really a tour de force report that I think it feels like the history of mankind according to food, because it really leaves no stone unturned. So congratulations. Well, I really appreciate what my colleagues have already said about the fact that corporations are so much behind where we are in this food dilemma that we have, where we can't just get to enjoy food anymore, and particularly in some cultures where literally their land is being used to grow ingredients that create this ultra-processed food that is so much of our market economy today. 3/4 of NCD-related deaths are due to unhealthy food. It's an enormous problem, and I think we have to start to really make corporations the guilty parties that they are. I think, unfortunately, food has this notion of being this benign thing that we put on our plates, we enjoy eating together every day, and unlike some of the other industries, alcohol, tobacco, that are much more on the hook for the kind of products that we don't need in our lives. We need food. We don't need alcohol. We don't need tobacco. And we're just simply not holding the food industry as accountable as they ought to be. A colleague of mine once said about the tobacco industry that, in a sense, they're committing mass murder. They're killing lots of people by essentially creating a product that, if used as intended, will kill people. And unfortunately, what we're seeing is food companies get away with murder in terms of the impact that they're having on people's lives. Food companies, like these other industries, have tons of money for marketing, and they use it. They use it to seduce children into eating products that are bad for them. They make a very difficult environment and context for people to get away from. So to Issa's point, we can't rely on individual behaviors. We have to change the behavior of companies. And regulation, as Issa said, is what we're doing, but in the food policy space that many of us are working in. Marketing restrictions, taxation, food policy labeling, etc. But we have to take some of the strategies that they use to market these products and turn them against the food companies. I think that's something that I know many of us are thinking about and really trying to think about multiple platforms to get back at their dishonest practices.
Yeah, and you point out how many of these products are unnecessary, right? So drawing that parallel between many of the sugary beverages that we find out there, the candy, all of that, with tobacco and alcohol products, right? We really need this. And so this kind of leads me to wonder a bit about commercial determinants of health. And Nina, I would love to ask you, if you can provide examples on how the food policy program addresses these determinants of health.
I would say that it is absolutely intrinsic and cross-cutting in everything we do. We have the exact opposite agenda and goals as the manufacturers of ultra-processed products. Our goal is to reduce consumption of these harmful products in order to protect public health. The manufacturers of these products, their goal is to maximize value and profit for their shareholders, and they do that by increasing consumption. So we have completely opposite goals here. And you know, as there's been discussion here about, this is not about individual choice. We live in unhealthy food environments, and we've got to change those environments so that healthier options are the default option for people. The way we're approaching that is through policy change. And the policies that we're focused on are things like, you know, reducing children's exposure to unhealthy marketing, front of package labeling, fiscal policy, so placing taxes on unhealthy foods and beverages, ultra-processed products, and then improving the public sector. So all of that work is really meant to reduce consumption and sales of ultra-processed products. And, you know, I'm sure we're going to get a little bit more into the tactics that our opponents use, but it's sort of, you sort of can't separate it at all from what we do. And you know, I think just to point to one example, if you look at sugary drink taxes, they've really taken off across the world. Since Mexico adopted their landmark tax in 2013, and it was subsequently very rigorously evaluated, and the evaluations showed it worked, and there has been so much emerging evidence around sugary drink taxes since then. We've seen many jurisdictions around the world follow. I think, you know, something like 50 jurisdictions now have sugary drink taxes. So I think that's an example of trying to sort of take on some of those commercial determinants of health.
And just going back to the role that the state can place in that particular instance. So I would love to ask Isabel, what can governments do to improve these health outcomes that are connected with food and nutrition?
Thank you for the question, Stephanie. I think my colleagues already started touching upon some of those examples, and Dr. T in her report extensively does so as well and applies a rights-based framework to them. What I would highlight is that it's an uphill battle. You know, all of our partners that are working on these policies, they know it doesn't even end when the policy is adopted. Nina mentioned the taxation issue, and just I think 2 days ago, the Colombian Constitutional Court upheld the taxes that, you know, advocates had really pushed for in that country. So it really is a matter of, you know, all of the advocacy that goes into it and all of the, you know, anticipation and preparation for when these policies get challenged, because they will get challenged in court, and corporations use all of the tactics, including litigation, of course. So taxation is one of them. The other policy that I would highlight is front of pack warning label, and just something that, you know, has really taken off in Latin America, and it's one of those instances where Latin America is really leading the world. And of course, it's a key tool to provide information, and not just any kind of information that is easy for people to understand, to process in their decision making, and that really impacts purchase decisions. So that's another one. And Nina also mentioned marketing, right? And the one thing that I would highlight about marketing is that it's not only marketing that is targeting children or targeting, you know, other people, other groups of people, but marketing to which they are exposed, right? Because when we're thinking about marketing that's targeting children, that's still something that is a lesser percentage of what really happens, right? I mean, the amount of marketing that is all over, you know, in schools or around schools that children are constantly subjected to, and that needs to be restricted. And also procurement tools. I would say government has a really big spending power, and that has to be put to good use. It's not acceptable that government is financing, you know, the industry of ultra-processed foods to the extent that they are currently, and they shouldn't be employing this to foster family farming to improve nutritional outcomes in schools, in public hospitals, and that kind of thing. And the last thing I will say about this is that all of these measures, there's not a silver bullet. It's not about adopting one or the other. They need it to be adopted together so that we can really be successful at changing the environment and giving people a better shot.
Sandra, what are some good practices that you would like to highlight?
Well, I love what you said about front of package labeling needing to not just be seen, but it needs to be easy to understand, easy to comprehend. And I think that's been a great innovation, making these warning labels much more intuitive than they may have once, or that they may have initially been conceived of as being in some jurisdictions. And so I think that practice of really creating much more transparency so that consumers can see, they have the right to see what's in the food that they're about to purchase. And I think we've been seeing some really great progress in even in places that we wouldn't have maybe imagined years ago, coming up with really great solutions for front of package warning labels. So that's something that I'm very pleased to see.
And Nina, could you tell us more about one or two challenges that you have witnessed when supporting civil society organizations that work in this place, trying to create those best practices or to scale them?
Yes, there are a few. So I think is coming out in this conversation, the interference by the manufacturers of ultra processed products is a very big challenge. We are learning more and more. So at Bloomberg Philanthropies, our largest program is in tobacco control, and there are many parallels between the playbook that the tobacco industry followed and the playbook that the manufacturers of unhealthy foods and beverages follow. And in fact, I'm just going to tangent for a moment, but I think it's really interesting and relevant to this discussion. About a month ago, a study came out that looked at, back in the 80s, late 80s, tobacco companies like Philip Morris and R.J. Reynolds had acquired some food companies. They had acquired Kraft Foods, General Mills, Nabisco, and at the time were some of the largest food companies in the world. And tobacco, as we all know, is very skilled at hooking people onto very addictive and dangerous products through marketing, through additives, through flavors. And what they did was they applied those same strategies to the food companies that they had acquired. And so it was really, if you look at the relationship and you look at when did ultra-processed products actually hit the market, it was when the tobacco industry acquired them and started transferring the same things they were doing with tobacco into food. And that is really where we can kind of trace the beginning of ultra-processed products. They were the first. And so, adding additives, really clever marketing, flavors, colorants, all this kind of thing. They had this massive library of additives that they took from cigarettes and they applied to food. So I think that was a little bit of a digression, but I think it's important because the playbooks are very similar, and what our partners encounter in all of the work that they do is massive interference from the food and beverage industry. And, what does that look like? That looks like lobbying. That looks like the industry funding their own research, often not peer-reviewed, so questionable methodology. It looks like them funding front groups. It looks like them threatening legal action, litigation against civil society organizations. So, we definitely, that is a very big challenge that we have to contend with. The industry, anytime there is even any hint of policy action, they will first try to stop it. And if they can't stop it, they will delay it. They will try to delay it. And if they can't delay it, they will weaken the implementation of it. And even then, they are constantly trying to reverse policies. And Isa had mentioned this. And, I think I just want to give a shout out to all of the advocates around the world, because even just holding on to a policy win in the face of relentless attack from industry is just such a huge success. So that's one very big challenge. But on the bright side, there is a lot of progress. We know this playbook. We will outsmart. We are outsmarting and outwitting the industry. We've got public health and evidence on our side, and we've got savvy, brilliant, strategic advocates all over the world who are just resilient and unstoppable. The other thing I will mention just really quickly, the other challenge we're really grappling with and our partners are grappling with is the issue of reformulation. So, there's this notion that, if we just replace sugar in an ultra-processed product with aspartame, that's healthier. But it is still, by definition, an ultra-processed product. And so I think what this is really revealing for us, what we're finding is we kind of get into this whack-a-mole situation with the industry. Like, you get a policy through, industry adapts, often through reformulating their products, and they therefore get around the policy. And then it kind of can feel like you're back at square one a little bit. And so what we're really, really intensively now focused on is using an ultra-processed framing. So it doesn't matter if that product has aspartame or sugar, it's still an ultra-processed product, and ultra-processed products are bad for you. And our partners are, doing some really interesting work in this space around raising attention and public awareness on ultra-processed products.
Dr. T, in the report, you discuss food and nutrition in the context of other emerging issues such as climate change, conflict, COVID-19. So how can the right to food be prioritized with all of these other challenges are happening at the same time?
I think we don't have a choice, an option. I think COVID did expose how urgent a lot of these issues that we're talking about are. And in fact, to build resilient societies that can thrive through a crisis requires us to be healthy. And to be healthy, we require nutritious, sustainable, diverse food. And so those rights, you can't separate them. We need to realize all human rights at the same time. And under the right to health, states have a minimum obligation to expeditiously realize their right to health. And I think that's something that they often don't want to make known, that there are minimum obligations. And then, of course, there's the progressive realization, which means you can perpetually for 30 years say, we will get to vaccinate everyone because we are progressively getting there. But there are minimum obligations, and the right to food and food security under the right to health is one of those. And so it was important to talk about it in the COVID context, because we know a lot of LGBTQ plus families and persons themselves were excluded from food programs in that emergency crisis because of their gender identity, because their family were constituted in the non-traditional cis heteronormative ways. And so there's a lot of states and governments who define a family as a man married to a woman. And if that structure is any different, you don't qualify for support. And so you can then see why it's important to then talk about crisis times, because if under health emergencies, because of your identity, you are getting excluded, what more when there's conflict and war? And we know right now, food and starvation is being used as a weapon of war. And so those are compounding challenges, and they are not separate problems. They affect people constantly as a cycle of oppression and structural violence as well. And so the climate crisis, for example, under the anti-colonial framing, rejects the notion that the global south and the population of the global south is responsible for where we find ourselves as a global community. For the sake of development, the rich countries, and they even call themselves the developed, right? The rest of us are not developed. But if you used human rights as a measure of development, there are no developed countries in this planet. They are yet to exist. So I think we also need to change the measures, or at least the matrix we use to measure development. Development without human rights, in my book, it doesn't quite translate to development. And so we need to really realize that for many people in crisis, because of climate change, because of conflict and war, because of protracted war and conflict, by the way, right? Places like Ethiopia, Sudan, DRC, Syria, they have very particular needs and challenges because of protracted war, and how those escalations may impact access at some point. And so the framework on the right to health of accessible, affordable, acceptable, and quality health can directly be applied to food. The food must be accessible, affordable, acceptable, and of quality. And so I think for me, that synergy was important to bring right now as the world and member states and the UN is preparing for the summit for the future to envision a new world and to say to them that we are already leaving people behind. You know, the slogan of leave no one behind, it's not a hypothetical scenario of the future. We are already leaving people behind. And so as we reimagine the future and what sustainable development goals we come up with next, we need to take that context into account. And without doing that, and without understanding the intersection of the right to food and health, we will continue to fail yet again. To get employment, you need to be fit and healthy. To be able to study as a child and grow well and concentrate in class, you need to be eating, right? A lot of children are just not performing in school because they're starved. And school perhaps is the only place where they get that meal. And when we think about school programs, we need to think of out-of-school children as well, who cannot get into school because their parents don't have documents, they're in an irregular migration status, and that further compounds what they could have had as a lifeline by being in school. And so how are we then tackling the issue of out-of-school youth, children, who are experiencing further exclusion and marginalization because their parents are criminalized because of sex work, or they're criminalized because of institutionalization. So it is very important to think really broadly about the usual things we think about, but let's think of the entire dynamic of the human experience and make sure that in our strategies, we don't repeat the mistakes of leaving people behind by being too narrow in how we define particular issues. And constant collaboration and convenings and finding from people what they need, I think is very important, so that we don't define for people what a successful, sustainable community looks like. You know, we need to support communities because they're already defining that for themselves. And we know that it's systems of oppression and disempowerment that keeps them from realizing those visions. The vision is there. It's that people need to be supported, and there must be accountability for when violations happen. And I think in the space of the right to health and food, there's very little consequence when actual rights are being violated. And I think those are the two, well, at least more than that, but in terms of right to health and food, with those two themes, you can really show a lot of parallels in state power, but interference, but also the power of individuals and communities' autonomy.
I really love how you're framing intersectionality as this comprehensive human experience, right? And all of the sides that play a role. So we cannot tackle one without the other. And Nina, I would love to ask you more about that dynamic, and especially in the context of collaboration in civil society between climate justice leaders, human rights leaders, and also food policy advocates.
Yeah, it's such an important question, and I think your report, Dr. T, just highlights these overlaps and interconnections really nicely. And there's absolutely collaboration happening between food and environment movements, and there needs to be much more of it. And to maybe be concrete for a moment, let's talk about water. We know that access to water is inextricably linked to health. And if for a moment we transport ourselves to a city in northern Mexico called Monterrey, this is a place that where taps have been running dry. They have had, because of the climate crisis, increasingly hot summers. That kind of coupled with recent weather patterns has resulted in drought. So people turn on your tap, there's nothing there. As a result of that, the city is providing water to people, but it's not suitable for consumption, you know? So what does that mean? People have to go and get drinkable water from the store. They've got to buy bottled water, which is often very expensive. Simultaneously, in a city like Monterrey, you have companies like Coca-Cola and Heineken who have bottling plants there who are extracting billions of liters of water from public reservoirs. So you have this scenario where these companies who are making record profits are essentially stealing water from the citizens of this city and selling it back to them at exorbitant prices. And, you know, and often water, as I mentioned, in many places, bottled water is much more expensive than a soda. And so people, if you've got limited income and you need something to drink, you need to feel hydrated, you're gonna buy a soda. And so it's kind of no wonder that in Mexico, it is the fourth largest consumer of sugary beverages in the world per capita. And that is associated with alarmingly high rates of obesity and diabetes. So, I mean, I think this is a clear example of a shared agenda with the environmental movement and the food movement. And, you know, I really do think we need to band together and center local activists. There are local activists in Monterrey who have been popularizing this phrase that this is plunder, not drought. And, we need to center these activists and look at this through a lens of, sustainability and well-being for our health and well-being for our planet. So they're absolutely interlinked. And I should say, this is not, I'm talking about Monterrey, but this is happening in other cities in the world. It's happening in Colombia. It's likely happening in other places as well.
Yeah, so going back to that role that corporations play and continue to play in this crisis. Sandra, practically speaking, we have so much value in that report, right? So how can we implement it? What are some policies, especially communications campaigns, that we can implement to highlight the findings in this report?
Yeah, in addition to just, really enjoying seeing all the intersections that you made in that report and that we're talking about here today, we've been reflecting on what our communication campaigns, which we've been doing now for a number of years in the food policy space, but thinking about food from a justice perspective and a human rights perspective is I think a bit different than what I think we initially set out to do. In all honesty about this, I think we weren't seeing necessarily all of those tendrils and how food is. Of course, it's nutrition. Of course, it's essential, but it is also a right. It's a human right, and that state actors need to take the lead in protecting that right. Although it's, as I think you've been hearing here, is a union of civil society, government, and other good actors who are really binding together against the bad actors, the ones that we've also been talking about. So I've really been admiring, Isabel, you were talking about Latin America really leading the way in so many of our policy areas and our innovations. And I think I would say that there's also a lot of leadership in the public communication and the communication campaigns that are aimed at policymakers in the food policy space because they're using a social justice lens and a right to know lens rather than, essentially talking about the ingredients in ultra processed foods. Not that that's not important, of course it is, but and also I think Nina was talking about the importance of the context within which we do these campaigns so that it's clear that while these campaigns are being seen by everybody, that we're not thinking about behavior change, we're thinking about policy change. And I think really creating policy change creates the context for people to change their behavior, right? To make it more difficult to have access to bad food and easier to have access to good food and water and things that are essential for life. So I think Nina was saying to you earlier before this began that your report has really been a really great help to the work that I think all of us are engaged with, because this report at the General Assembly, we can hold it up as our roadmap in a way, or a really legitimate document that legitimizes not just the work that we've been doing, but also really enhances our own thinking about the approaches that we need to take to do that counter marketing. So again, thank you for that.
Yeah. And Isabel, you're fighting the same fight, but from the legal and strategic litigation perspective. So how does these apply to your work?
Thank you, Estefania. I echo Sandy in everything that she was saying. And I just wanted to circle back, in the very beginning of this event, Dr. T, you were saying, I hope this, this actually goes somewhere. I hope this is useful. And I can tell you that it is. We've heard that from multiple partners in our own work. I think, at the O'Neill Institute and our initiative, Health and Human Rights Initiative in particular, we very much live in this intersection between, international standards and regional standards and what's happening on the ground at the national level. And oftentimes we see these standards incorporated into cases that are being, trialed by the Supreme Court and advocacy efforts with regulatory agencies. And all of that really does make it into national level processes. And I can give you an example. We were talking about front of package warning label just now. And that is being litigated in Mexico. It's now in the Supreme Court. And the case is expected to be decided quite soon, I think in the next couple of weeks. And I know that you, in your mandate, sent a letter to the government of Mexico where you were really emphasizing that front of package warning label is a rights compliant regulatory measure, that it should be upheld, encouraging the government to uphold it. So that kind of effort, I think, is a great example, right, of how these things make it into legal discussions, not only in court, also in court, but in Congress, in regulatory agencies, with conversations with governments. And I think that just having the rights-based framework to back those measures is very important because, as I was saying before, it changes the narrative, right? Yeah. We're very used to saying that, this should be allowed, and now we're not arguing that it should be allowed. We're saying, if you're not doing it yet, you're doing it wrong. Because the status quo should not be allowed. What we're currently experiencing, that should not be allowed. So yes, I echo also my colleagues in thanking you for the report because I really do believe it will be transformative. It already is.
Thank you.
It's worth you being tired. I'm just joking.
No, you are correct. I am.
Dr. G, one element of the report that really stood out for me was this discussion of the cultural importance of food. And how that plays a role into the fabric of communities, the fabric of families. So why is it so important to include that aspect of access to food in this report for you?
It was important because for me, it speaks to the ultimate freedom and the reason why I do the work that I do, but also the way that I do it. I think I believe in absolute autonomy, and the right to self-determine is something that I really hold very seriously and dear to my heart. And when I think about food and the experiences of food and the cultural significances, diversity, the desires we have, and the stories we tell with food, and the emotions that food, takes out of us. We experience food with all of our senses. I think that's one of those experiences that does not leave any of your senses untouched. And that's why food as a source of pleasure is such a powerful concept. And a lot of people, in terms of their culture, continues to be demonized. A lot of how we eat, what we eat, continues to be, subjects of ridicule. And if you think about dignity, for example, as the ultimate goal, part of restoring who we are as humans, as a people, perhaps people of African descent, with the history of slavery, right? The connections that we would have with food and the stories we would tell through our food would look very different. And I always make this example that after all of the colonization that the British Empire did, their best dish is still mashed peas and fish, and like, come on. Right. And so
It's mushy peas. It's mushy peas.
Mushy,
yeah.
mushy. And just to illustrate that you can't fake it. Yeah, you can't fake it. And food is about that identity, that sense of belonging. And that is very important. And that's why part of colonization and part of the violence of colonization is to disconnect you from your land, is to cut that cord that connects you to your culture. And it's to cut that cord that connects you to indigenous knowledge and practice. And that is why it's dehumanizing. And so part of claiming our humanity, part of the resistance for me through food is that it's recentering culture and practice and diversity and the ultimate desire of being human, of being full, the feeling of satiety, the feeling that I've had enough and I'm about to roll over and just pass out because I'm so full. That feeling that, and I think for me, there aren't that many shared experiences of being human, but that's one of them. And the right to health and the right to nutritious food are one and the same thing. And if you think about mental health, for example, and the threat of food insecurity, experiencing starvation, experiencing famine. I mean, our bodies know, for those people who have experienced famine, how your body's DNA even changes and how it stores food, because it knows of the trauma and it tries to be prepared for the next cycle. And so there's different ways that your body responds to that trauma, literally, and it shifts and stores food and fats differently in your body in preparation of even your own body, your own DNA is anticipating that trauma. So imagine then living under racism every day, under sexism every day, homophobia, transphobia. All of these things compound and they manifest themselves in particular ways. That's why one of the first questions anyone will ask you when you're having a mental health assessment, are you eating well? When was the last time you ate? The first thing that goes when you are unwell is your appetite. That's the first thing that changes. Either you eat a lot or you eat less, but there will be a noticeable change. And so the link between health, mental health, food, nutrition, culture, healing, restoring, justice, it's all linked and it's all, for me, one thing. And we need to work with each other across movements because we can't be everywhere where we are needed, but we need to know that we have allies and co-conspirators everywhere, that even if I'm not in the room, I know that when you are in the room, you will talk about the issues of LGBT populations that are being excluded from being defined as a family. I need to know that there are people who are busy now talking about criminalization and the impact of criminalization of sex workers, for example, and how that is targeted gendered violence, by the way, when we know statistically sex workers support 7 adults and 4 of those, 7 people and 4 of those are adults. So other adults are benefiting nutritionally with food security from people who are doing sex work, and yet it's the same people who are judgmental, who are violent, who are criminalizing the very sex workers. It's women again who are taking now a double burden of being providers, then you get judged for how you are providing, yet you didn't create the systems that left you destitute and marginalized in the very first place. And so for me, all of these are linked to one movement of social justice, racial justice, but ultimately it's about restoration of dignity.
Thank you. Thank you for those powerful words, Dr. T. And now we're gonna open it up to the audience for Q&A. Thank you to all of our panelists as well. Hopefully, we're gonna have a lively discussion. So the way this is gonna go is I'm gonna open up for questions here in the audience, but also virtually. We have one of our wonderful allies monitoring the Zoom chat, so we can also take questions for the audience. I'm gonna repeat the question here so that the people in the broadcasting can also hear those, and you can either direct it to any of our experts here or to all of them. So yeah.
Did we shock all of you into silence?
Oh, yeah, please.
I'm Palak. I'm from the Center for Economic and Social Rights. Thank you all. This was an excellent discussion. One of my questions were we discussed two separate methods that governments are choosing to tackle this problem policy-wise. One is taxes, and one are behavioral changes labeling that both of you talked about. Both have certain limitations based on their behavioral biases to people and them understanding the salience of the tax as well. Is there a general global trend in the policy of governments to choose one over the other? Is that all the governments, most governments are choosing to go towards labeling or taxes?
I can start. Thank you for the question. It's a really excellent question. And I think, with the decision that I was mentioning in the Colombian court, a lot of the legal, debate around taxation will start getting a lot of that on the record. I think your question is interesting because a lot of the debate around taxation is sometimes framed as, we are going to remove access to food, and that's going to impact the access that people have. So I understand how you're framing it, about labeling versus taxation, and what I mentioned before, that these things, usually the way that the WHO incentivizes is that they're a package, right? I mean, one or the other without the other measures, they won't solve the problem. So yeah, what I think is that taxation is, one of the primary things that we need to remember is that it is meant, that the health impact that these products have, they are an equity issue as well. It has a higher and a most disproportionate impact on certain groups of the population, and taxation is meant also to address that. So the way that it comes out in the public debate, and a lot of the narrative is pushed by industry in the saying it's going to harm people who are, on the most disadvantaged end of the social economic spectrum. It distorts a lot of the debate, and it distorts a lot of what is actually driving governments to adopt that measure in the first place. So in regards to one or the other, I would just say that, it's complementary, and I think we need to keep pushing for that as a movement. Yeah.
And maybe just to add, that's why good governance is important to always discuss as well, and good fiscal policy, often when we talk about food policy, because those taxes should actually be reinvested in programs that will directly benefit the people who need it most. And also, again, with the small-scale farmers, local farming, but also sustainable methods as well. And, often we talk about women in business and that, women can't even get microfinance, never mind the big capital. And I think we do need to have a gender equity lens to that as well, so that we embed the fact that we can tax the corporates more, but where do those taxes go? Because if the taxes are still not used, there's still corruption in government, it still will not yield the desired results. So we need to think of how do we close the loop. And I think for me, it's important to tax. It's important to make sure that whatever is being collected does good work. And the front package labeling it's part of a human right. It's the right to have information to make informed decisions. And there's no way you can choose one over the other. And so strategically, you should be asking for far more than you think you will ever get, because somewhere you will land, in a good place to start and keep building. And I think that's what's really important, yeah.
Juliana.
Hi, thank you so much, Dr. T, for the report. My question is about how we approach the advocacy with the great movements that are, working on the different areas. I really like that you are talking about the interrelationship between climate, right to health, gender. But my observation in the field is that because there are different advocates working in these different fields, there are also competing interests. And so I struggle in figuring out where to place the energies, because right now climate is trending, and so people are forcing everything to be climate, even when it genuinely doesn't. There's a time when there's also debt sustainability because it links to taxation, and everyone is also trying to link everything to debt sustainability, but it just doesn't fit. And so I'm trying to reflect on how do we center ourselves in the field to be able to benefit from this intersectionality, but also handle the competing interests across the fields. Thanks.
And I'm sorry, I think I need to repeat the question. So I have the challenge of summarizing Juliana Nantavas from OSF wisdom here. But in summary, the question reflects this intersectionality and how do we prioritize efforts given that sometimes funding can be given competing signals. So right now, as you correctly point out, climate change is trending and climate justice, and there's a ton of funding for that. But is there funding also for the health and access to healthy food space?
I can give it a go, I think. So let's speak about funding and resourcing in global health as something very centralized, and that the decisions are made without true participation of rights holders and true diversity in those spaces. And often what gets determined as urgent, as important, doesn't quite often translate or match what communities think is urgent and important for them in the moment. And then you also then have the problem, not only are you competing for very few funds, you are spending every year applying for new funds. So you are not even spending all your energy in implementation. You are now splitting between reporting and actually raising more money, which again, decreases our ability to be as effective as we want to be. And the other thing, of course, is that when programs do happen and they don't speak to the needs of the people, you'll often, hear that there's low uptake. We need to put more information, public communication, and let people know things exist. It's not necessarily that they perhaps don't know they exist, it's that they're not speaking to their needs. They are not dignified. They are not humanizing them. They may very well often be perpetuating harmful stereotypes about particular people, situations, and make people feel disempowered and infantilized. And I think a lot of communities are very sensitive to that. And they would rather be left alone to figure out their lives, which they will do whether we come with a project or we don't come, because they're figuring out their lives anyway. We're in this room right now. Whether we do anything tomorrow, communities are solving their own problems. So there's a humility that's lacking in global health, in global governance, in the multilateral system generally. And I think part of why we are not succeeding is that we take on this savior complex and not understand truly that because of earned privilege for some of us, but some people have undue privilege, that we do have a responsibility to listen and to accept that we need guidance ourselves from the people we claim to do this work for in terms of when is needed, what is needed, and how is it needed, and allow communities the autonomy to make decisions as opposed to wanting ourselves on the one hand to criticize governments for not doing what they should be doing, but then wanting to take over autonomy and decision-making power of communities and do this work on their behalf. We need to also not replicate or make the same mistakes as well. And the reasons, of course, many civil society exists. Why? Because government aren't doing their jobs. And what does accountability look like that gets governments to do their jobs so that actually civil society isn't the one that's carrying the heaviest of the burden of filling in the gaps where government should actually be doing services and giving services to people. So yeah, it's not a simple answer, but I think there are many points to it. But I think it's important to talk about the need for honesty, I think, in the space, and for true consultation. You know, all of the programs have monitoring and evaluation, but that's like at the end of the program. I always say, let's do monitoring and evaluation first and learn.
Right.
Once we have done the learning, we can start the other steps of project design before we can even implement. And that requires time. And we often feel that we don't have time. And because we already don't have enough money and resources, us ourselves feel like we're already failing before we've even started. And yeah, it's a very tough space to be in as well. And especially in the grant making spaces where Black people are not trusted with money, it's a problem, it's the reality. So again, you can't separate this from racial justice, from gender justice, and all of those other things, because grant making itself is very problematic in how people set the agenda and which targets matter most for health and all of that. Yeah.
Any additional questions? Maybe online?
Is one in the back?
Oh, there's one in the back, yeah.
Hi, thank you for this discussion. I'm studying to be a dietitian, and I want to work more so like not on the legislative level, but seeing people face to face every day. And I was just wondering, how do you think we as healthcare workers can collaborate with people on the legislative level and work with our solutions or communities?
I love talking about healthcare workers. And I am one, so I can drag us for filth because we deserve it most of the time. I think part of health sciences and medicine has a history as well. And we need to accept and be honest that a lot of the disciplines and the specialties in medicine are harmful to particular populations. And when you talk about, being a dietitian, immediately I'm thinking body mass index. It's been shown that it's, as a measure, as a matrix, it's harmful and it's not accurate. And so you need to pass though. So you'll still be using BMI, right? And what is your responsibility then to unlearn some of the harmful things you were taught as a science, that when you start implementing them, you know that you are actually harming your community. That was a very hard realization for me as a doctor, to know that I have been taught in very white supremacist ways how to practice medicine. And part of me passing and being a doctor required a level of assimilation and being harmful in that process. And that was very hard to acknowledge. But I think that's where the magic lies, is when you can be honest and interrogate what you are inheriting and decide for yourself if that's working for you or the community you are claiming to serve. One of the most important things I would say is continue to be a perpetual learner and a student, but also listen to what your patients say and find your voice and that one thing that you can contribute to, because you can't fix everything in the field, but there may be one or two particular things that you can do really well that can change or shape or have impact. But I do know, as this health sciences graduate, we are really not taught good things in our curriculums. And part of the whole movement about skinniness and what body types looked like were a tool of colonialism and white supremacy, right? Where when you are thin, you are seen to have control and borders, and you are able to control yourself. That's the word I'm looking for. And there's a snobbery about it, and there's a classism about it. So the higher people, the more people make money, the thinner they become. And when men are wealthy, they choose skinny women, right? As a symbol of this opulence and this cultured and orderliness. And that's why the royal families have the traditions they have about the knife, and you cut a piece like this. Like it's a mess. But once you go down that Pandora box, you won't stop, because you will see how even social behavior and what we call etiquette is all linked to particular harmful stereotypes about what is allowed, who's allowed, and how social spaces are controlled. And that's why ableism is bad, because even how architecture and social spaces are designed to make you feel that unless you are skinny or with this particular body type of a particular way, and therefore you cannot be here or you are not welcome here. And so all of it is tied. And read an article called The Whiteness of Milk. It's fascinating about breastfeeding and formula feeding and the ways in which, it's called The Whiteness of Milk. Find it, as a dietitian, find that article and read it tonight. And it's gonna possibly change the way you approach your practice. And you are asking really important questions, and I think keep asking them and never stop wanting to be better. Recognizing that we are being taught in very harmful ways, and to do justice to your patients, you are going to have to unlearn and teach yourself very different things. Yeah.
Can I just add one other thing? My addition is going to be much more boring than what Dr. T just talked about. But first of all, it's so exciting that you're studying this and you're already thinking about, connecting your work to policy change. I would say that I think this is probably true in every country in the world. Healthcare workers have a lot of credibility, and so I think to have communities of healthcare workers very publicly show their support when there is a policy debate going on is always, always, always helpful. The reality, though, is, and you likely know this, there are often, if you look at dietetic associations, certainly in this country, there are really unsettling conflicts of interest in terms of how they're funded. You often have big food and big beverage funding these associations, funding dietitians who are influencers, to promote certain things. So I would just say, even kind of trying to work within your system and your communities to sort of avoid these conflicts of interest, because it does have an impact then on your ability to credibly push for the kinds of policies that we're talking about. So just would make that one little addition.
Thank you. And we have a question from the audience. So how should governments and intergovernmental organizations approach dialogue with alcohol and food industry? And should these industries be differentiated in terms of legitimacy from the tobacco industry?
I'll kick that one off. What am I getting myself into? But so, to your question earlier, I was thinking about sort of, it's not new, but I think it's gotten more traction in the past few years, which is this notion of how do you fight back against the commercial determinants of health. And it sort of aligns a little bit with the answer to the question I'm going to try to attempt in a minute. But it's, I think the question that you asked and that Dr. T gave a great answer to was about, how do you locate yourself within sort of many tempting movements. I think we're all drawn to many movements in our lives, and like, where should we put our energy and our efforts, right? And so here we are talking about food and all of the things that are connected to food, and yet the climate folks will think it doesn't have anything to do with climate, although it clearly does, and the tobacco folks will think, well, how are we going to align ourselves? And then there are many other movements, some of which are very community, grassroots movements that are struggling, as Dr. T just described, to look for autonomy and to look for self-realization. But I think one thing that, and I think, Nina, you said this earlier about the similar tactics that these commercial companies use. They use data that's just simply, they use, what is the coinage? Alternative facts. And what we have on our side are great data for the burden of alcohol, tobacco, and all of the other commercial determinants. And I think to the question that's being asked here, I mean, there is definitely a playbook that all of these industries use to both hook kids, to make false claims about job losses if they if taxes are raised on unhealthy products and workers are going to lose their jobs. They use that argument in South Africa. Not very effectively because a tax did go through on sugary drinks in South Africa, even though the industry claimed that people were going to lose jobs in soda factories. And I think they use very similar arguments in tobacco and alcohol. They market to kids, they argue that things are going to disproportionately harm the poor, et cetera. So the commercial determinants framing might be a way to bring several movements together who are pushing back against these industries. Again, it won't capture everybody, but it does offer a possibility to look at the importance of regulation across all of these sectors at the same time. So that's how I would respond to that.
Can I add one other thing to that? And I'm not sure if I may be misinterpreting the question, but it sounded to me like, should we be making distinctions between the alcohol industry and food? And my very perhaps simplistic answer to that is no. They all have the same motivation, which is to sell us harmful products. And they use the same tactics. There are revolving doors between these industries. So I don't think it helps us to make these distinctions of, alcohol is worse than food. I do think we all need, on Sandy's point, we need to come together. And this reminds me of a really prevalent and I think unhealthy debate in the food space, which is the food industry part of the solution? A lot of people in public health will say, well, we have to work with the industry, they're part of the solution. And, as we talked about earlier, well, actually their motivation is completely the opposite of ours. So they are not part of the solution. And, our view is that this industry, whether it's alcohol, whether it's tobacco, whether it's food, should not be sitting at the health policy making table. They do not have a role there. And I don't think it helps us to sort of pit alcohol against food or against tobacco. In fact, we all need to come together because there's very much the same actors and the same tactics.
Can I also add something? It's interesting because also thinking about what got us to the point where, publicly there's an acceptance that the tobacco industry does not belong in the table. So I think it's also it's interesting to think back and see how we got here and how can that process happen with the other industries. And I think with tobacco, a lot of it has to do with the fact that a lot of the tobacco documents became public through litigation, in past decades. And that horrified a lot of, big chunks of the society because, a lot of how the decision-making was happening came out and all of those things. So I think denormalizing some of these, it goes hand in hand with exposing all of the misbehavior and things that normally we, when I teach about commercial determinants of health, I still do, the cartoons of, Flintstones and Tom and Jerry smoking, and people are horrified, right? I mean, the students are like, what is this? But when I show Tony the Tiger or Ronald McDonald's or all of the, they think that it's normal because it's still normal for us. So I think that the way that we think about the question of undue influence of conflicts of interest, it goes hand in hand with how we perceive the behavior of these industries and what they're doing and how it comes across. So, I don't think we'll get there until we actually manage to bring all to light, all of this.
I mean, and just to say that's why these are human rights issues, because one of the key principles is transparency. Not only can you not fight rights you don't know you have, but you also cannot demand justice when you don't know there's injustice being done. So the opaqueness of the industries is by design. And part of litigation and being strategic about it, where the courts actually work in some jurisdictions, is to go through the courts to enforce and force the hand of the government to do the right thing. And of course, South Africa is one such example of a country where the courts actually work. And transparency is something that is very important. And I think there's a lot of learning that can happen in terms of what tactics worked for what context and why. And I think we ought to be using the judiciary in a much more in more, but it costs money to litigate as well. So we need lawyers who are really interested in public interest law. Nothing wrong with mergers and acquisition, nothing wrong. But we desperately need to retain more legal scholars into the practice of public interest law. And I think that's where a lot of for me, especially as an abortion provider doing sexual and reproductive health rights work, half of my patients are struggling to change their gender marker and their names. You then realize how hard and how expensive it is to get justice because of how expensive it is to go to the courts. And so part of that accountability is, what are we demanding from other aspects or other areas of society that also hold us back from accessing the information or accessing justice? They may not be the cause, they may not be the food industry, but what kind of society generally are we demanding? And that will enable many of our activities to be successful. And being too narrow focused and being too siloed, it hasn't worked at all. We know that as a fact. And so it is important about framing this as human rights first and foremost, and getting allies who will understand that you may be talking about tobacco, alcohol, or food, but we all believe in dignity, we all believe in non-discrimination, equality, transparency, accountability. So why are we not working together? As opposed to looking too much at what divides us, especially in the human rights movement, we ought to be doing a lot more of what unites us and move forward with that.
Yeah, so I think, thank you so much for all those answers to all of these difficult and challenging questions. What is one thing that you would like people to walk away with when it comes to understanding the impact of this report? And that's a question for all of you.
Is there an order?
Whoever wants to go first, yeah.
I can
You
kick
can go
it off.
first.
No, I would just say, kind of repeat what I said before, that this, the way that I see this is that the report has just been born and hopefully will live a long life. So, it's the stepping stone. And now it's up for everyone, advocates and people that are watching and, litigators to really take ownership of that and go to court with it and use it in their campaigns and advocacy and pressure politicians. So yes, that's my hopeful note.
I mean, just I agree completely with what Issa said, but also human rights and social justice. Those are the words that really resonate with me.
Yeah, I was going to say something very similar. I think it just is this legitimate, credible document that will allow us to advance a human rights framing in this work. And I think the other thing is it just so nicely shows the connectedness of food with every other aspect of our life. And I think that can be really helpful when you're meeting with other communities and movement actors, and it connects those dots really nicely.
I'd also say inspiring. That's
Yes.
Dr. T?
It feels so self-indulgent. Oh, must I really? No, look,
Final words.
Yeah, look, for me, I can tell you the intention behind the reports. Of course, it's part of my mandated duties to report to the General Assembly and the Human Rights Council. But I really do have all of the stakeholders in mind when I write the report. And it's always my wish that there will be something that academics will find useful, that the scientists and the researchers will find useful, that communities will find useful, and civil society can find useful as well, and try and tell a story for everyone that shows them why they need each other and why this is all of our problem to solve. And I see myself as a movement builder, and I hope that the report contributes for this moment, a building of something really important that affirms and make sure that we can realize the right to food and health.
So before we close today's sessions, I have a few housekeeping items for everyone here and also for the audience. So you may have heard about the report. Very important report. So please share it, read it, comment on it, create discussions around it. Everyone, as you know, we pointed out today, everyone has a role to play, from policymakers to advocates to people trying to feed their families. Everyone has a voice here, so please go ahead and share with your colleagues and with others. In addition to today's event, Dr. T and Isabel Barbosa were interviewed in an episode of Vital Strategies, Vital Talks podcast. So the episode was released, my understanding is today, but it can be found by searching Vital Talks whenever you stream your podcast. And also we're gonna include the links here in our chat. So please subscribe to the Vital Talks podcast and listen to past and future episodes on topics like public health and healthy food.
And Nina was interviewed on
And
one of
Nina
our
was
podcasts at
interviewed
one point.
as well.
Yeah.
Bonus episode. Yeah.
And finally, and more importantly, please join us in our reception, where we're gonna continue celebrating this important work. Thank you so much.
Thanks to you.